on perhaps all the controls at the same time. Yeah, very powerful. Another thing is a big advantage with having contextual animations. For example, if we were to create an animation for a button press effect, we don't have to create the animation for every button. We can just assign that generic animation to any button. So long as the variables that the animation is changing exist, then the effect should work. So that means that, we have simplified application development, reduced maintenance, because when it comes to changing these things, we have a centralized location to change. And the main benefit is, rather than having many versions of the animation that are really the same, they boil down to the same, we can really reduce the memory usage, because we don't have to have as many copies of a similar animation around. So the animation lifecycle, I feel like it's worth mentioning in here. So an animation, starts off in its non-running state. So at this point, only a definition exists. So it's important to know there's a slight difference between a definition of an animation and when an animation is live and running, there's an instance of an animation in the memory. And that instance of an animation it's very important because this is when the particular variables are resolved. So if we look here, we've got these squiggly lines here, these tildes. And what that means is that those are relative variables. So they're going to go from the current value. So as your animation progresses, if it encounters the beginning of an animation step and the value, the from value is relative, that's the moment in time where we will resolve that variable. So we will look up, in this case, the GRD width, and we will resolve it to a real value according to its current value in the UI. So that's important to know how that works. An animation can also be paused, which means that at a later time it could be resumed. An animation can be stopped, or it can run to completion naturally. So important thing about these stopped and completed states is now we have the ability. So in the past, animations always performed a cleanup when they run. So this means these values, the relative values, it's at that point that they become kind of forgotten, you could say. So what's important is if we ever wanted to run an animation in reverse now, is we can specify not to perform that cleanup, which means we'll be able to run that animation backwards and we'll still have all the information about where we originated from. So it's a really important change that happened in 7.0, is now we can specify not to clean up an animation and we can actually trigger it backwards. So that brings us to what's new in 7.0 with respect to animations. Well, we've got three new main pieces here. So we've got our progress. So when we trigger an animation now, we have the ability to specify where in the animation it should start. So a normal animation, it begins at 0 and it progresses all the way to 1.0. Whereas a reversed animation, you could specify, hey, start this animation at 1.0 and go in reverse. So it'll start at the end and it'll move all the way to the beginning. So this is where as I said, you specify it when you trigger the animation. Another thing we can do now is we can trigger an animation in its paused state. So that's really important now with the ability to specify the progress. So we can specify where to go in an animation, and we can specify, hey, don't run the animation, just stay paused at this position in the animation. So that's what allows us to tie it to external stimulus. So if we were to receive events from a backend system, we would be able to adjust our point in the animation according to those events. And the last value, already mentioned it a couple times, this is our cleanup. And by default, that value is true. So we trigger an animation, we resolve our variables, And then when it's done, that instance of an animation is torn down and removed from memory. But we have the ability to keep those around now so that we can trigger an animation in reverse. So just another quick note on that. Yeah, just watch out for that cleanup because, if you do run an animation and clean up, you can still run it in reverse. But what's going to happen is the variables are going to resolve to their current values, not the values they used to be, but the values they are now. So if we've changed those, then we're essentially changing that animation at that point. So just definitely something to look out for. If you want to trigger an animation in reverse, it means you need to trigger the animation in forward without a cleanup. So let's jump into Storyboard a little bit and do some animating. Excellent. So I've got this simple application here. It's one of our home automation samples that we use for training and various demos. We're just going to play around with this. This is going to serve as our playground. There's a chance that I also pop into another application, one of our samples, to demonstrate some other animation-specific techniques as well. So I figured I would just get started with a simple animation using the timeline. And I wanted to demonstrate a context-based animation. So let's go ahead and get started. So I want to make an animation for these 4 buttons. And I want to make it a very simple fill that just kind of shows itself and hides itself when the button is clicked. So it just kind of fades in and fades out very, very subtly. Let's go ahead and do that. So to do that, I'm going to add a fill. So I'm going to add a new render extension, a fill. And I'm going to choose the color using the color picker. And I'm going to sample this blue field here to get the nice blue. Great. So now I've got a color chosen. I'm going to set my alpha to 0. And I'm also going to add a variable. So I'm going to bind it to a variable here. So add a variable. I'm going to choose a new variable. I'm going to leave the default name alpha and the default value 0. Say finish and OK. Great. So now we've got a new render extension and a new variable. Pretty easy. But it only exists on one control for now. That's OK. We're just going to focus on a single control for now, and we'll migrate it over to the others. So first things first, let's add a new animation. I'm going to call it menu button pressed. I'm going to leave it at 60 FPS, and I'm just going to say OK. So the menu button pressed. So the first thing I want to do is I can right-click here, and I can say add an animation step. And the animation step I want to add is going to change the menu layer climate, which is this button. And I'm going to change the alpha variable that we just added. I'm going to change it from 0 to 40. And I'm going to make my duration 200 milliseconds. So now we've made our fill visible, but I also want to hide it again. So I'm going to go ahead and double click beside my first step, and it's going to automatically add another step for us. And it's going to choose the same length. So I can change the end value. I can either change it in the properties up here, or within the timeline, I can double click it and I can choose 0 for my end value. So now we're going to go up to 40 and back down to 0. So if I want to simulate this and see what it looks like, I can using our simulator tool. I can see it gives a nice little flash effect. Looks good enough for me. I like it. So one thing to note about this animation is it is changing a very specific variable. So it is changing menu layer climate.alpha. So that is very specifically this variable. Now we don't really want that, because if we want to apply this animation on other controls, well, that's not going to work, because this is very specifically changing the alpha variable on the climate control. We don't want that. So in order to make this animation contextual, we can choose to replace our keys here that are relative to a very specific control and we can make them more generic. So if I choose to change the design context here from application, and I choose the climate control, since in this case, all our variables in the animation are relative to climate, I can do that. And then it's going to ask if I'd like to apply the context. I'm going to say yes in this case because I do want my keys to change according to the selection that I'm making. So I'm going to say yes. And you'll see now that my key switched. So it used to be $app menu layer climate alpha. And now it's $control alpha. So this means that we now have a generic animation that we can apply to any control. And as long as it has an alpha field, we'll be able to animate it. Excellent. So from here, what I'd like to do is I can preview it again to make sure that I haven't broken anything. Yep, so it still previews okay. But now what we want to do is we want to take our render extension and our alpha, and we can select these in our application model view, and we can say edit, copy. And then what we can do is we can select security, calendar, and settings, which are our other 3 buttons here. And I'm holding my control key down so that I can multi-select. Then if I right click, I can say edit and paste. So now what I've done here is I've added a fill with a variable onto each one of these controls. So they're progressing along to being able to be manipulated by our menu button pressed animation here. So if I would like to preview our animation on something other than the climate button, I could do that. So the way I would do that is our design context. Again, we can leverage this button again. So we are currently set to climate, and that's why we're previewing on the climate control. But if I were to move that to calendar, for example, and in this case, it's going to ask if I want to apply the context. And we said yes last time. And that's because we wanted to change our keys. This time, we specifically don't want to change our keys. So we're going to say no. We're going to leave it as a control independent variable. So now when I hit preview, it should preview in the context of the calendar button. So the same animation is now going to run in a different context. So you see the calendar button now flashes. Good. So that means our animation is well formulated to be able to be used across different controls. So what's left now is to be able to trigger these animations. So to do that, I'm going to right click on my climate control. I'm going to say add action, and I'm going to trigger by a press. And I'm going to go ahead and do a animation action, and I'm going to trigger the animation menu button pressed. And in this case, we don't need to change any of these default values. It's okay. We want to start at the beginning. We don't want to pause it. We don't want to reverse it. And it's fine to do a cleanup at the end. So these are all the defaults, and they're all the correct values for us right now. So now that I have that animation, I only have it on one control, but I could easily simulate our engine and make sure that that is working as expected. So there we go. Got the animation on one control, but not on the other. So that's good. So now what we can do is I can copy that animation that I have on a single control, and I can move that to the other 3. So you might ask yourself, how does it know which context it's running in? Like, how does it apply the correct context to the animation? And in this case, the reason is, since the action that is triggering the animation is on a control, that control automatically becomes the context that that animation is using. So that's why when I click the settings, when I click the calendar, they're being used as the context for the animation. Now, if we were triggering them from an action, at a higher hierarchy level, we would need to invoke the animation, we'd need to trigger it from Lua, where we could, that's the place where we would provide that extra context if we weren't triggering the animation directly from the context we want to use, like we are in this case. So now that we can trigger it, there's one thing to note, is that same animation is actually running in a, the correct word, exclusive manner. So that animation, since every time it runs right now, it has the same ID. So by default, an animation is triggered with an ID that matches the name of the animation. So right now, the ID of the animation, every time I trigger it, doesn't matter what button I trigger it on, is called menu button pressed. So what this means is while menu button pressed, the animation with that ID is running, only one can ever run at a time. So if I click 2 buttons in quick succession, you'll see that it will pause it'll stop the animation and trigger the new one. So this is how come here when I press really quickly, it leaves these animations halfway in between. So that's on purpose. So that's the desired behavior there. So what we can do to get around that, if we want to run these animations, the same animation consecutive at the same time, what we can do is we can trigger them with a specific ID. So if we look at our actions here, our ID was left blank. So as I said, it uses the default menu button pressed as the ID. But what we could do is we could give it unique IDs. So as long as we don't ever have another animation named climate, that could be a unique ID, or what other thing we could do to make sure that it will be even more unique is we could give it the fully qualified name to the control, menu layer climate. In our case, since we have pretty tight control over this, we can get away with just giving it the unique name climate. So that's for that one. For this one, we can give a unique name security. And so on and so forth. And this will allow us to do the same thing with while enabling the animation to have multiple instances running at the same time, since they have unique IDs. So there we go. Now all 4 of those animations are going to be triggered uniquely. So that means we can now have them running at the same time without exchanging one running animation for another running animation. So that's a really important thing to know if you want to use context-based animations. It means usually you trigger the animation with the name of the control you're triggering it on, or the context, usually like the fully qualified name for the context. Yeah, it's a very important trick for being able to perform that task. So another thing I wanted to discuss was the ability to have animations triggered by external stimulus, and not just triggered, but also the progress value of the animation being triggered by external stimulus. So to do that, I quickly put together this little layer here, and it's called our progress layer, and it contains just 3 things. It has an arc, and our arc is just this blue arc looking like this. It also has just a label and this semi-transparent background here that we see, just to kind of cover up everything behind it, but not all the way. Great. So what I want to do is I want to establish an event. So I'm going to open up my event editor from the toolbar up here. So this is the place where we add custom events. So we define the events that we expect to receive, either internally or externally, incoming or outgoing. So in this case, I'm going to say add a new event, and it's going to be incoming. And let's call this update.progress. So this is some type of loading, perhaps a backend is doing some work, and we have to pause our front end for whichever reason, and perhaps we want to display a loading bar to the user. So update.progress, incoming, and then we want to specify what data we're going to expect from our event. So in this case, we're going to keep it very simple. We're going to go with a variable called progress, and it's going to contain a single a single 32-bit float. And this float is going to share the same mins and max as our progress value. So progress, as I mentioned before, goes from 0 to 1. So what we can do here is we can specify the same range. Great. So now I've got progress. Excellent. And which means we can add in an event. Actually, first let's define our, so we've defined the event that's going to drive our animation. Let's go ahead and define our animation. So I'm going to enter into our animation recording now. So up at the top toolbar, we've got these buttons here. We've got the one with the camera. It says toggle recording animation. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. It's going to outline my editor in red. And it's going to say recording frame 1. So first thing I want to do is I want to make my layer visible. So if I toggle the visibility, and then I can do a animation snapshot action, because that's my first step. Layer visibility is now toggled. The next step I would like to do is I would like to take our progress arc and want to take it from 0 degrees all the way to 360 to complete the progress. And so from there, let's do another snapshot. And then our final step will be to hide our progress layer again. And we'll take a snapshot, or we'll just end the animation recording there. So we'll toggle it. And we'll call this one, I'll just call it very simply progress. Excellent. So this is the way that it comes out of our animation recorder. Looks pretty good, but I'm just going to go ahead and stretch out my my end angle step to start at 0 and be 1 second instead of 500 milliseconds. Not that it really matters too much, but I think it'll just make everything a little bit easier. Great. So we've got our little animation defined. And what's beautiful about the technique I'm showing you is it could apply to any animation. It could be as complex as our animations are allowed to be, which is incredibly so. And the same technique works. So running an animation using the seeking or running in reverse, there's no real limitations there. I've got it defined. I've got the event defined. Now the last thing to do is hook up a mechanism to drive that event. Drive the animation. So what we're going to do is on our application layer, let's go ahead and add an action. Let's have this action triggered by our update.progress event. We will trigger an animation. And this is where it gets kind of cool, actually. Some more 7.0 features are going to come in here. So we're going to trigger the animation progress. And this is where it gets really cool, is we can tie it directly to our progress. But what's nice is, as of 7.0, we have the ability to directly use event data in our actions. So we're being triggered by update.progress. We have data in that payload. And rather than going to Lua, pulling that data out of the event, we can now immediately pull it out in line. So we can specify $event : progress, which means if the event has a progress field, we're going to use it. Otherwise, it'll be a value of 0. So we'll go ahead and use event data progress. And then the last thing, since we're seeking the animation, we don't want to trigger the animation truly, which means we're going to invoke or trigger the animation in its paused state. So it's not actually going to run the animation. It's just going to skip to that progress value and stay put in the pause state, which does mean it could be resumed in the future with the animation resume call. So I think that's good for us. We don't need to worry about reverse or cleanup in this case. So we've defined our animation. last thing we can do, I guess, before we actually try to run it live is we can preview our animation, make sure that it previews correctly, and it's not. So that could be indication of off, on. Let's see what happens when we run it as well. So I'm going to go ahead and run. I'm going to open my connector here. And what I can do is I can open it in a floating window, which will allow me to interact with my connector and not steal the focus away from the engine. So if I were to send myself this update.progress event, you can see immediately that the climate screen progress layer is now no longer hidden, which is good. And one other thing I can do here is I can right-click on the value. Instead of typing them in manually, I can switch this to a number slider. And it just gives us a little bit more of a convenient field to interact with. So now I can move this, and you can see immediately that it's updating in the animation. And what's cool is we can actually go in reverse as well as forward. Interesting. Let's see what I've done here for that too. Well, that did kind of fall. Let's see here. Why would that have? If I switch my... Excellent. Let's see what happens if I try that again. The connector, loading. So I think in my case, the reason it was having a difficult time is because of the fact that I was using a relative value. I think in that case, it would be best to specify a cleanup value of 0, as in let's not clean up. So I think that's pretty much where I wanted to leave this sample. I did kind of want to dive into, I did want to pull up one of our samples that we ship by default, just because there are some excellent animation techniques that we've used in there, and it's worth highlighting them because they've changed between 6.2 and 7.0. So in the past, this very sample had twice as many animations. So for every animation, we had a corresponding animation that ran in reverse. So if you guys have animation, or if you guys have applications that you've developed from prior versions, you probably are very familiar with this pattern of having 2 animations, one for the forward direction, one for the backwards. Well, this is no longer required, which is great because it really simplifies things. So if I were to give a really good example, on our weather screen, we have this weather toggle animation, and it is a pretty, there's a lot of stuff happening. And this is actually relatively simple compared to some animations I've seen in the wild. So, you know, there's almost 15 different steps here that are being 15 different keys that are being changed. And what's nice is we can run that same animation both forwards and backwards. So if I simulate my application, I can see the same animation running one direction and the other direction. And really, the way that we do that is very much like what we've just done. It's in our actions where we call a Lua script. So this is one thing I wanted to show is how we would do a trigger from Lua. So from Lua, just like in our animation action, when we trigger it, we have all those same fields available. We actually have even an additional field. So we have context, ID, cleanup, reverse, and progress. So in this particular case, what we've done here is we're leveraging the new functionality, animation get state. So this is great because now we can get the state of an animation, whereas in the past, rather than asking the engine, hey, what's the state of the animation right now? As application developers, we were actually responsible for keeping track of the state of the animation. Like, oh, I know I triggered the animation, so it must be running. And I know that the animation completed because I received the event, so I know it must no longer be running. So you see, there's a lot more state management required in the past, whereas now, rather than keeping track of the state, we can actually query the state. Much easier approach. So here, every time that button's clicked, we can take a look at the state and we say, is the animation not running, or has it been complete? And sorry, if it's currently running and it hasn't been, and it's not complete, then we actually just early out because it's still busy. So we're done right away. So otherwise, what we do is we flip the direction and we can trigger it in the opposite direction that it most recently ran. So it runs forward, then the next time it's clicked, it runs backwards. And one of the things that's important is that it uses our progress value. So we want to trigger it from the current progress value. So when we want it to go forward, we trigger it from progress 0. It really comes in handy here as well. So we have these 3 toggle controls. There's actually a 4th on this screen as well. Uses the same mechanisms. So just like before, where we had actions on different controls that were being pressed, similarly, we have the action, but the action calls into Lua. And what we do here in Lua is we call that same function animation trigger, and we fill out this animation data accordingly. So we choose the appropriate context, a unique ID, and then we choose the progress value. So in this case, we actually use the current value. And you notice we don't early out. So if the animation is currently running, we actually allow that. And we just switch the direction and we start at its current value. So if I switch to our fan screen here, you'll see if I were to click, it just turns it around and runs it in reverse. Whereas it would have a completely different effect without the ability to specify the progress the way that we can. Yeah, so I thought that was very much worth discussing. I think that was everything I wanted to talk about from the perspective of using Designer and creating rich animations. These sessions are really great, but where I find we have a lot more capability to teach and educate is really in our training that we offer. So Crank Software offers training for teams that want to really learn how to use our tool. And they're really great sessions because we sit down for 4 different sessions and we will build up an application from the ground up, making rich animations and learning a lot of different techniques. So instead of being instead of being so rushed, we can really take our time, have a lot of back and forth questions, and in the end, we usually build an app that's quite beautiful and covers so many important points of storyboard development. It's really great. Totally recommend it to anybody watching. If they feel this was good, then those are 10 times better. Awesome. Well, I'm going to pass it back to Scott, and I just want to thank everybody for listening and watching, and I hope you all have some wicked, awesome storyboard development in your futures.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you for talking about the training. So yeah, definitely, as Mike said, give it a go. If you haven't done any training in the past, but some of these advanced user trainings, we're just taking a deeper dive into just a sliver of the different aspects of the tool. And so really gives you that opportunity to have that more kind of hands-on, and as Mike said, a lot more of an engaged kind of dialogue to, fine-tuning what aspects you want to be educated on when it comes to storyboard. With that being said, of course, just to kind of, before we wrap up things for today and I jump into your questions, so now's a chance, if you haven't put your questions, to pose your question, is that if you haven't in the past visited Crank's Help Center, definitely give it a check, right? Because through that Help Center, you're going to find a wealth of information, like I said, a variety of getting started videos, or even within the knowledge base articles, we kind of put videos there when we can, because it's so much easier just to show instead of putting down the words and then you having to decipher what it is that you're looking to do. The other thing too is if this is the first time you've been part of the advanced user training sessions, it's something that we started running within 2020 and we will continue to run it throughout 2021. So definitely check out any past training sessions that we've done. They can be found within our webinar and YouTube pages and will be put into the Help Center as well. And then last but not least, definitely, if you want to learn more about all the great things that Storyboard 7.0 will bring to the table, then definitely register for our webinar that's coming up shortly. So that can be found on our cranksoftware.com/learn/webinar section of our webpage. Not only that one, but you can find all the webinars that we've done on demand there as well. So definitely it's a wealth of information, but definitely register today so you can find out about all the great things that Storyboard 7.0 will bring to the table. So with that being said, now is the time to jump into your questions. And so Mike, I have a couple of questions here for you. The first one is, what properties can be modified within the animation tool?
That's a good question. So basically, any variable in Storyboard can be changed in animation. So the way our controls and render extensions are set up, a control has several properties. Each of them are always available. So they're called attributes. And then our render extensions, they're optionally dynamic. So a value is either static or you bind a variable to it and it becomes dynamic. So any variable that you have bound can be changed from an animation.
Perfect. I have another question around frame rates. So just asking, what type of frame rates can the animation tool support or Storyboard support?
It's a great question. So really, frame rates always comes down to your hardware that you're running on. So you typically want to aim for a frame rate that matches the hardware capabilities that you have. So a standard 60 FPS is typically easily achievable on pretty much any one of our target platforms. So that's that, but you could always go much higher than that. There's really no limits. It's about really what your hardware can produce. So yeah, generally I find on a desktop PC, it's kind of governed by your monitor more than anything, actually.
And actually, that's a great question, because I know we get asked that a lot with frame rates, and I know sometimes there's an expectation about certain frame rates. 60 frames per second is desirable, but not all hardware can always support that. And then sometimes, being creative when it comes to animations on maybe the lower end memory devices. You can be creative like that. I've seen in the past where, if you have a powerful device, an animation's great, but then maybe a more of a flipbook style animation, which is just a series of images that gives you that animation-like effect, but in a lower kind of memory capacity, right? So that's a good question. Another question, is there a way to uncover the size of the animation created using the tool?
The size, as in like the runtime impacts?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what
it's a great question, but I don't think we currently have any metrics for the impact that an animation has in overall memory and size. But typically, it's good to know that your animations are actually not terribly large. Even a huge animation is actually still quite small data in data size. So if you compare animations to images, images will quickly take up much more memory than a animation. But where that changes is, on our MCU platforms, our images don't consume memory because we draw directly from Flash. So, in that case, that kind of measurement isn't correlating. But really, the animations are just a couple fields of data for every step. So they're not very large. But no, I don't think we have a current metric.
Okay, that's perfect. That's some good information there. And then the last one I can address, the last one is, when is Storyboard 7.0 coming out? And so the answer to that is actually we'll be launching Storyboard 7.0 on February 24th. So it's just around the corner. And hence why, like I said, if you want to learn about all the great things, we have a webinar scheduled for that day. So if you head over to head over to cranksoftware.com and go to our resources section, you will find the ability to register for that webinar. All right, just check. This is your last chance to answer any other questions if you have it. If not, I just want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy day today to come listen to myself and Mike impart a little bit more wisdom for you when it comes to storyboard and in particular animation controls. So with that being said, thank you very much and have yourself a good day. Bye.